Hi, my name is Dr. Tom Crouch. I'm the Senior Curator of Aeronautics at your National Air and Space Museum. And today we are at the NASM's Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center at Dulles Airport. We're really two museums, one museum in two places, on the mall and here at Hazy. So we hope folks will visit both. Today we're going to talk about one collection created by this woman, Evelyn Kendall. Mrs. Kendall was a Bostonian, born in Canada, but lived her whole life in Boston. She began collecting aeronautica, the remnants of very early flight, as early as 1922, and was still going in the 1960s. She amassed one of the nation's great collections of early aviation memorabilia. And we collected it in 2012, and we have it on exhibit here at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy facility. Let's turn around, start over here with the case. When the balloon was invented in 1783, a wave of just literally wild excitement swept first across France and then across all of Europe. People had waited for millennia to see human beings fly, and suddenly here it was, right before their eyes. And as a result, consumer culture was actually just beginning in the modern world in the late 18th century. And once the balloon was invented, you could slap a balloon on any kind of small object. There's a snuff box, patch box, little pill box, a needle case, even a case for dance cards. You could put a balloon, an image of a balloon, on any of those kinds of small consumer goods, and they would just fly off the shelves. And they were created in such numbers that in the middle of the 20th century, when people were getting enthusiastic about the airplane, fixed-wing aviation, natural collectors like Mrs. Kendall looked around, and here was all of this 18th century material in antique shops just ready to go. And so a group, relatively large group of Americans for the most part, began buying this stuff up. And Mrs. Kendall, as I said, was one of the big collectors. So these objects are part of the collection. You can see our fans down here. When we got the Kendall collection in 2012, I'm supposed to know something about very early flight. What do I know about 18th century ladies' fans? But we were able to make a contact with the gentleman who runs the Fan Museum in Paris, and he was able to indicate that 6 of our 7 fans were really manufactured 1783, 1793, in that period. So, and a few American things. Back here in the corner is a band box, a hat box, with an indication of Richard Clayton's 1835 ascent from Cincinnati. So people through the 19th century were still producing these items of balloon memorabilia. So let's go around the corner, and we'll look at some of the graphic images in Mrs. Kendall's collection. This is a print that was done in 1783, and at that time you couldn't do printed pictures in color. So if you see an image like this and it's in color, you know that it was hand colored because you couldn't print color yet. And this is an image of the world's first gas balloon filled with hydrogen being flown in Paris from the spot where the Eiffel Tower stands now. And if you look at this, you can see that the title up here is backward. That's because prints like this were designed to be seen on a simple 18th century machine called a zogroscope. You put the print flat on a table and you look at it through a mirror and a lens. and it gives you a sense of depth perception in the print. So when you look at it that way, what's reversed now will be the right way, and you can read your print. Again, this is the very first gas balloon, much too small to carry anybody up. But if you look at it here, you can see it's tied off. Well, as the balloon goes higher, the pressure of the hydrogen inside the balloon is going to go up, and the pressure of the atmosphere is going to go down. So eventually, what's going to happen, and what happened in this case, is that the balloon burst, and it fell on a little village called Gonesse. And there was still hydrogen in it, so the thing was burbling around on the ground. And the peasants were frightened. They thought that a demon had fallen out of the sky. So you can see that they're attacking it with pitchforks and scythes. They're going to tie it to the tail of this horse and drag it in triumph through the streets of Gonesse. Gonesse is sort of an unfortunate place when it comes to aeronautical accidents. It's where, again, the world's first gas balloon ended its short life, but it's also the place where the Concorde crashed. It's only 7 or 8 kilometers, really, from the end of the main runway at Charles de Gaulle. It's quite close. And the Concorde came right down, unfortunately, on the edge of Gonesse. So the world's first gas balloon. As we walk down here, this is one of the first hot air balloons flown before a large public. The Montgolfier brothers, Joseph and Etienne Montgolfier, invented the hot air balloon, and this one has this little cage down here at the bottom. No people, balloon's still too small to carry people, but in the cage are a duck, a sheep, and a rooster, the first living creatures to fly, and this flight was at Versailles. And down here, this is an English image of that event, but it was done by an artist who had never seen a balloon. He had read news articles that the animals were in a wicker basket. They were actually in a cage, but he's shown them in like a picnic basket. And the balloon, of course, doesn't look like a hot air balloon at all. Ballon in French just means ball. And so that's the way he showed that hot air balloon. This is the first balloon to carry human beings aloft, November 21st, 1783, from in front of the Chateau de la Muette in Paris, carried 2 people up, a fellow named Pilatre de Rosier, and another gentleman, Francois Laurent, who was the Marquis d'Arlande. And as you can see, it's quite a large balloon and beautifully decorated. The Montgolfier brothers, who, again, invented the hot air balloon, were paper makers, and they had a family connection with the Revillon paper-making company in France. At Revillon, they made wallpaper, and so their balloon was beautifully decorated by the artisans in Paris who decorated wallpaper. Ballooning began in Paris, but it spread really rapidly, and this is a painting of a balloon in the French city of Nantes in 1784, and I like this one because it shows so much of the technology. How did you generate hydrogen in 1783, 1784? Well, you did it in barrels, and you can see the barrels down here. They would fill them with dilute sulfuric acid and iron filings, and that produced hydrogen and a lot of heat and steam and other things, but the hydrogen was what counted. And they moved the hydrogen through this long thing where they cooled it and deacidified it. If they had put the hydrogen generated from the barrel straight into the balloon, the acid would have burned holes in the balloon. It would have been so hot it probably would have set the thing on fire. So they used this manifold to cool it by bubbling it through water and lime water to deacidify it. And you can see this tall pole. Because the hydrogen flowed out of these barrels really so slowly, with almost no pressure at all. If you had had just the balloon laying on the ground and tried to fill it, you never would have filled it. The stuff wouldn't have penetrated into the balloon. So they would put up these tall masts and haul the envelope up this way when they were inflating it. So it's a really rare painting done by a fellow named Etienne Chevalier de Lorimier, who was the great French balloon painter of the 18th century. And Mrs. Kendall was fortunate enough to bring it into her collection. We come down this way. Women were among the first balloonists, and these are images of two really famous women balloonists. This is Sophie Blanchard, who was the wife, second wife, of Jean-Pierre Blanchard, who was the first human being to fly the English Channel with the American Dr. John Jeffries. But Sophie Blanchard became a balloonist herself and was one of the best known, in fact, in France. This print shows her flying at the entrance of King Louis XVIII coming back into Paris. She, unfortunately, was to die a little later in a balloon accident. She would actually go up in a hydrogen-filled balloon and set off fireworks from the balloon. And her balloon caught fire at one point. She was actually able to put it out, but as she was coming down, she hit a steeply pitched roof that threw her out of the basket. So the sad end of one of the pioneering women balloonists. And this is another one, Elisa Gonoran, who was famous, as you can see, for parachuting. She would go up on hot air balloons like this one and parachute back down to the applause of the crowd. She was a great daredevil and the niece of a famous balloonist, André Jacques Gonoran, so Elise Gonoran. Again, these posters, these prints rather, like the objects in the case, newspapers and magazines in the 18th and even into the 19th century, early 19th century, really couldn't print detailed pictures. And so people would do single sheet prints like all of these, and they were sold in print shops all over Europe. We don't even have print shops anymore. But this is the way people discovered what great national figures look like, what great public events look like, what the balloons and the balloonists look like too. So let's come on down here. I'm walking past some of my favorite things, I must say. This is another kind of print, again, hand-colored, and this one looks Japanese, which is because it is Japanese. It was done by a fairly famous Meiji-era print artist named Yoshitori Udagawa. And we call these Meiji-era prints because they were done after the installation of the Emperor Meiji in the 1860s. And they're a little brighter, more garish perhaps, than the classic pre-Meiji ukiyo-e kind of prints and so on. This one depicts an event that took place in this country in 1860. The first Japanese embassy to the United States visited that year, landed in California, went all the way across the country, and when they got to the East Coast, everyone threw parties for them. When they got to Philadelphia, the city fathers had arranged for this fellow, Thaddeus Sobieski Constantine Lowe, to fly a balloon with another balloonist, in fact, in honor of the Japanese visitors. And this print, which memorializes that event, was actually done in Japan 8 years later, 1860, and the print dates to 1867, 1868. And if you look at some of the buildings, they look really very odd. And that's because Utagawa never left Japan. The only notion of Western buildings that he had came from an issue of the London Illustrated News that he had put his hands on that had an article on Agra, India. And so the buildings that he did in all of his prints depicting Western scenes, were actually based on that one issue of the London Illustrated News of an Indian city. He had no idea what Philadelphia actually looked like. So that raised a question in my mind, talking to the people at the Smithsonian's Freer-Sackler Gallery of Asian Art, Museum of Asian Art. If that's true, how then was he able to figure out what Thaddeus Lowe looked like? Because that is a portrait of Thaddeus Lowe. I was able to find an issue of another illustrated newspaper, Frank Leslie's, in which there's a big portrait of Lowe, and his head's at exactly that angle. And I think the only explanation is that Utagawa got his hands on a copy of that issue of Leslie's illustrated newspaper. We had a tough time translating the Japanese. We have a docent, a volunteer here at the museum who was born in Japan and who's a native Japanese speaker. He's a world-class aeronautical engineer, but again, a native speaker. So I asked him to come in and look at the prints here at the Hazy Center, and he was dumbfounded. He could not read the Japanese. And we discovered that it's because in the early 19th century and into the mid-century when this print was done, the Japanese were using a special kind of calligraphy that isn't used anymore. And so normal Japanese readers can't read this. We actually had to send it to a friend of Tom's in Tokyo, who's a university professor, who was able to translate this for us. And we discovered that Utagawa, while he got the scene pretty well, except for the buildings, had completely misunderstood. He thinks this is Washington, D.C., whereas the scene actually took place in Philadelphia.
Some questions?
Yeah, are there any questions?
Yeah. So Sarah asked, was it unusual to have women involved so early in something like ballooning?
No. Because ballooning was essentially a spectator sport, these people would sell tickets and huge crowds would show up to watch them inflate the balloon and take off and that kind of thing. It was a special spectacle if a woman was going to fly the balloon. So from the late 18th century, Sophie Blanchard and Elise Ganaran and so on were flying then. Through the early 20th century, it was really common to have women balloonists. In fact, in the late 19th and early 20th century, you know, they would fly in tights and they would go up with hot air balloons hanging onto trapeze bars. And they would do stunts on the trapeze bar and parachute down to earth. So the answer is no. Lots of women balloonists. And of course, women continued to pioneer into the age of the airplane and as well.
George asks, when did they start ballooning in the United States?
We started ballooning in the United States as early as 1784. There was a fellow here in the Washington area in Bladensburg, Maryland, named Peter Carnes. He was a lawyer who found it more profitable to run a bar in Bladensburg. And he had read in Alexandrian newspapers about the balloons being flown in France. And just like the artist down there who illustrated a balloon, never having seen one, Peter Carnes built a balloon, never having seen one. He weighed close to 300 pounds, so he couldn't fly it himself. Once in Baltimore in 1785, he was giving a balloon demonstration with a tethered balloon, and a 13-year-old kid named Edward Warren, short and skinny, walked out of the crowd and asked if he could fly on the balloon. And sure enough, 13-year-old Edward Warren becomes the first American to fly from American soil. John Jeffries, who flew the Channel in January 1785, was the first American to fly. But 13-year-old Edward Warren was the first to fly from American soil.
How is art important to aeronautics in general? How is art important to aeronautics in general?
How?
Is art important to aeronautics in general?
Oh, art like this, I think, is incredibly important to aeronautics in general, and this museum in particular. We celebrate the Wright brothers and Glenn Curtiss and all of the early aviation pioneers, but we tend to forget that the first human beings to leave the ground didn't do it in airplanes. They flew in balloons like this. And while balloons are much simpler craft than airplanes are, that's why balloons appear first. Balloons are actually inspired by the scientific revolution when people were investigating the physics and chemistry of the atmosphere. And the principle of the balloon is buoyancy is so simple, enunciated in ancient Greece by Archimedes, that balloons are relatively easy to build and fly. Airplanes are incredibly difficult. They grow out of really complex engineering research and that kind of thing. But, I mean, the history of flight begins with the balloons, continues through the airplane, right on up into the space age. From my point of view, the excitement, the thrill of flight begins in 1783 and continues today.
How much of the Kendall collection do we have on display? How much of the Kendall collection do we have on display?
The Kendall collection, when we got it, when Vanessa Nogengast and I were working with it, my collections processor, began with about 1,700 objects. Some of those were books, which went to our library. Some of them were archival materials, posters, scrapbooks. They went to our National Air and Space Museum archive. And in the end, I think she and I accessioned 730-some items into the aeronautics collection. Mostly prints, but the kind of objects that you saw in the case as well. In this exhibit, we have a little over 50 objects in the case and a little over 50 images, paintings, and prints on the walls.
Great, and we'll close with a question from Gail. She asked what your favorite piece in this collection is.
What my favorite piece in this collection is. Shall we walk to it to close? Actually, all of these wonderful, I mean, this dates to 1784. These things are over 230 years old and lovely. I mean, look at the colors. Another Japanese print. Look at the lovely, again, those garish Meiji era colors. And again, images of some of the first balloons in the world. But if your question is, what's my favorite? It's just around the corner here. This is actually a Shadowbox, and it's not that old. It was built in Florence, Italy, in the 1950s, and Mrs. Kendall bought it from a dealer in California. But it's so wonderfully done, just as a work of art, I think, and in fact all of us who put the exhibit together were just kind of enchanted by this. For me, it kind of sums up the huge public excitement that greeted the invention of the balloons. When those first balloons flew in Paris, 400,000, 500,000 people would show up. Half the entire population of Paris, one of the largest cities in the world, would show up to see these things. Again, this just for me captures that sense of excitement and enchantment that people felt.